Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today we will be talking about the first of two Victory Days. Today we're going to be talking about VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. That is not the only day we're going to be talking about. We're actually going to be talking about almost a year of history, or well, really probably more like half a year, all the way from around September of 1944 through May of 1945. This is the Victory in Europe Day. That's what VE stands for. So that would tell you that the next lecture will be about VP Day, Victory in the Pacific Day. And we are going to talk about how the Germans are under incredible pressure from both the Americans and British and the Russians. And we're going to talk about several important events that were going to occur that was going to bring Germany closer and closer to their inevitable defeat by this point. And that will include Operation Market Garden, the Battle of the Bulge, and the Russian advance from the east. So, with all of that said, we've got a lot to cover today, so let's dive right into it. So, where we left last time was the advance of the American and British forces that had forced the German troops out of Paris and across the Somme. This had occurred less than 90 days after the invasion at Normandy, which we commonly call D-Day, that was part of Operation Overlord. With the ousting of the Germans from Paris, Operation Overlord was officially over. That was the objective of that operation, and so now we move on to a new phase of the war. Remember that Allied morale was high, and many people along the Allied lines believed that the American and British forces might be in Berlin as soon as December of 1944. And by the very fact that we're talking about things all the way through 1945, I think you can guess that that did not occur. One of the main problems that the American and British forces faced was the fact that the American and British commanders had very different outlooks on how to advance. As I have mentioned on multiple occasions, we don't need to really bog down on the details. Suffice to say that General George S. Patton and General Bernard Montgomery were almost as opposite as you could possibly imagine. Patton's philosophy was to attack, 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 while Montgomery's philosophy was to build up as many troops as possible before moving forward. In fact, to give you kind of an idea of what we are dealing with in this section, let's read this quote by George S. Patton. George S. Patton said, "Men, all this stuff you hear about America not wanting to fight, wanting to stay out of the war is a lot of baloney. Americans love to fight. All real Americans love the sting and clash of battle. When you were kids, you all admired the champion marble shooter, the fastest runner, the big league ball player, and the toughest boxers. Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war. The very thought of losing is hateful to Americans. Battle is the most significant competition in which man can indulge. It brings out all that is best and removes all that is base." So to suffice to say that Patton wanted to push forward, and he wanted to destroy as much of the German forces as he could. And again, Patton was just going to push forward as quickly as he can. Now, Patton is a complex character, and one I wish that we had more time to go into, and if this was a regular school year, we would actually spend most of the lecture talking about him. But for this year, we'll have to suffice with just a short blurb. George S. Patton had served as a affiliate with a French tank division during World War I, and he had then served as one of Eisenhower's right-hand men during the interwar years. With the outbreak of World War II and American involvement in World War II, he was moved up to command a large army in the United States, commonly referred to as the Third Army. This army participated in the torch landings in North Africa. He also participated in the initial landings in Italy. However, it's at this point that Patton got himself into trouble. Patton had quite the temper. He also was known for being brusque and brash with his own troops. And when one of his men was experiencing what we would call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but what people in the 40s called shell shock, he grabbed the young man and he slapped him across the face, and he told him to get back out there and fight. And unfortunately, this event was not well received by the high command, and Patton was placed on inactive duty. He was reassigned to a training division back in the UK. In fact, Patton was actually placed in charge of a fake First Army that was the one that those Canadian troops we talked about last time were building to fake the Germans out. And the reason this was done is German spies saw Patton's army name on this army and thought to themselves, this must be the invading army, because Patton was already famous for his incredibly aggressive actions and his aggressive stance. That being said, the Americans and British need generals who can fight. So Eisenhower requested that Patton be transferred under his command after the D-Day landings had officially taken place. So on June 7th, 1944, Patton is transferred from this imaginary command of the First Army and given the Third Army again, reconstituted this time, but landing in France. Patton lands in France and does a remarkably good job at driving the Germans back. Again, Patton understood that the Germans could not be given time to find themselves. The Germans could not be given time to kind of shore up their defenses and deal with the Americans. And so again, he pushed forward, as I talked about last time. He rushed from German supply depot to German supply depot, stealing their supplies so that he could push further into German lines. Eventually, Patton ran out of fuel. He crossed the Somme River and chased the Germans almost to their own territory, but he really did extend his supply lines too far. He couldn't find any more German supplies, and so he was forced to wait for the rest of the army. General Eisenhower and General Montgomery came up much slower, although they enjoyed tactical success as well. And so the entire Allied offensive ended near the French border in October of 1944. Now the question was how to advance next, and here Patton and Montgomery began to butt heads. Patton wants the direct approach. He wants to follow the Germans right across the Rhine River and straight into Germany. However, Montgomery says that that is utterly foolish, and the German line of forts will probably prove too difficult to break through. Instead, Montgomery suggests a northerly route, a route that will take the army across the Rhine River, but not in German-occupied territory, but instead in the areas of Belgium and Netherlands. Now, this area was still controlled by Germany, but this seemed to offer a less defended route. Now, this is one of the few moments in the war where Montgomery had an offensive idea, as in an idea to attack. The problem is that in order for Montgomery's plan to work, a huge number of things had to go right in sequence. The main thing of which was that American and British paratroopers had to capture a sequence of 13 bridges and prevent the Germans from detonating a bomb that would destroy a single one of those bridges, which, by the way, both the Americans and Germans were aware that the Germans had contingency plans to blow up the bridges in case of an Allied attack in that direction. So effectively the task was this. The Americans and the British had to land 13 separate paratrooper divisions to capture 13 separate bridges, and they had to do so in a way that prevented any of those bridges from being destroyed. And in addition to this, they needed to keep the idea and the information of where they were headed away from the Germans as much as possible to prevent the Germans from erecting defenses behind the last bridge. To do this, they decided to move in sequential order. The paratroopers would be launched on each bridge sequentially. So the first bridge would be taken, then the second, then the third, then the fourth, then the fifth. And the Allied army would move across the bridges as quickly as they were taken. And so when the 13th bridge was captured and that message was radioed to Nazi HQ, the American and British army would already be across the bridges and in their area. Unfortunately, this plan fails. And the reason it fails is the final bridge cannot be taken. And by the way, this actually leads to a phrase which I don't hear very much in American slang anymore, but I certainly am familiar with it. My parents used it on several different occasions, and that is the phrase, a bridge too far. And what that means is you had this great plan. It was just a little bit too ambitious because the Americans and Brits captured 12 bridges. Had the Rhine crossing only taken 12 bridges, the plan would have worked, and the Allies would have captured Antwerp, the modern-day capital of Belgium. Antwerp is one of the largest ports in Europe. It would have allowed the Allies to move huge amounts of supplies into the area and would have significantly shortened the supply lines to get people like Patton their supplies and would have enabled a much stronger push into Germany. With the detonation of the 13th bridge, unfortunately, Antwerp lays outside of American hands, and they're going to have to go the slow way by building their own bridges, and Antwerp does not fall to the Allies until February of 1945. Had it been captured in late October, early November, again, we could have seen an Allied army in Berlin by December. But this fails, and ultimately, it does not work. Again, because they had to go a bridge too far. The Americans instead followed Patton's plan and began pushing across the German-French border in a number of different ways, slowly advancing against crumbling German defenses. The Germans were throwing every possible soldier and every possible piece of weaponry against the Russians. The Russians, since the Battle of Stalingrad, which we've talked about in our in-class discussions, had been building up a almost innumerable amount of military force. More than 50,000 tanks and enough artillery pieces to lay them end-to-end from Moscow to Berlin 4 times over were backed by millions of Russian soldiers who just continuously pressed down on Germany. In fact, many historians of the war have pointed out that the German army killed 3-1 when it came to conflicts with the Russians. So for every German soldier killed or wounded, there were 3 Russians killed or wounded. And yet the Russians continued to advance. The Russians seemingly had infinite manpower and infinite industrial capacity. And the hatred between the Russians and Germans was intense. The Germans, upon their invasion of the Soviet Union, as we have talked about in the past, committed a number of war crimes, not just against the Jewish inhabitants, which we're familiar with, but also against Slavic people, which the Russians are a Slavic people. And so the Russians returned the favor when they captured Germans. Horrific tortures, executions, and a failure to capture unarmed prisoners and things like that. Now, that is not to excuse Russian barbarity, but certainly Germans and Russians were giving each other very similar treatments in the Eastern Front. And so most of Germany's military resources were being diverted to trying to hold off the Russians. In fact, in the late war, in March and April of 1945, many German generals admitted that the only reason the fighting was so intense on the Eastern Front was to literally allow the Allies to capture more territory. They wanted more of Germany in Allied hands than they did in Russian hands, and so they fought hard to keep the Russians out while the British and the Americans kind of broke in through the back door and captured them. This has led some people to suggest that it was the Russians that really won the war, and that is simply not true. The Germans would have lost. The Americans had just as much overwhelming firepower as the Russians did. But again, the Americans treated their prisoners with respect. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, it was not who was more militarily successful. It was who the Germans actually wanted to surrender to. They knew their goose was cooked. The question was, which side are they actually going to allow to capture most German territory? And they settled on the Americans. And I think this is very wise. All of that being said, that's actually just a prelude to one of the most famous American battles of the war, and that is the Battle of the Bulge. As these troops are being diverted to the east, Hitler decides to attempt one last breakout attack on the American and British lines in the west. And he does this by gathering together not only some veteran troops that were recovering from the Eastern Front, but he also mobilizes almost every male in the German nation. And he sends them to the German-French border, and he orders his general to make a drive-through, punch-through attack. The plan is to send a wave of German troops and German armor and punch a hole in the American lines. Once that hull is punched, the Germans would fall upon all of the Allies' supplies, and that would leave the Americans isolated and might even force the Allies to either come to a peace settlement with Hitler or surrender those armies and have to fight basically all the way back from Normandy a second time, an action that would have almost undoubtedly exhausted Britain and would have required huge increased resources from the United States. Much to Hitler's surprise, although considering the quality and the experience level of the troops he threw against the Americans, not surprising to us in retrospect, this attack does not work. It does, however, create a bulge in the American lines. So the American line did get close to breaking, but rather than break, it simply deformed in shape. American troops retreated, but they found good defensive positions and they began to dig in. In fact, Patton had been expecting an attack of this sort almost all December, and so as soon as the attack began, he asked General Eisenhower, the chief commander of this area, for permission to attempt to stop the German advance. And Eisenhower said, General Patton, there's no way that you already have a plan put together. And Patton said, I in fact do. I planned for this eventuality eventually. If I can just issue 2 words to my men, they'll have this situation cleaned up for the rest of us. And Eisenhower says, go ahead. And Patton goes out and issues what is ironically, probably his most famous statement during the war, and that is play ball. Play ball was the code word to the Third Army to strike north as hard and as quickly as possible. And effectively what this does is it cuts the German advance off from their own supply lines. So rather than punch through the American supply lines and destroy their supplies, instead the American Third Army punched up and isolated a pocket of German troops. And so the bulge is no longer a bulge but a bubble. And in the interior of the bubble are German troops, which are being constantly pressed and crushed together by American troops until eventually the Germans realize there is no hope and they are forced to surrender. Now, that being said, this is a serious offensive. Thousands of American troops die fighting bravely to contain the Germans, and hundreds of thousands of men are wounded or exposed to the elements in various different ways. So the Third Army does defeat the Germans and leads the charge, but this is still a major blow to the Americans, and it forces the Americans to stop for almost a month and a half while they regroup, reorganize, and get the wounded out and get fresh troops in. And so the American advance on Berlin is stopped. So in that sense, Hitler was effective. And if I can give you an anecdote from that event, my father actually took German in college, and his German professor was a young boy of 12 that was sent to the Western Front to fight the Allies. And he was given an anti-tank weapon and remembers firing the anti-tank weapon on an Allied tank. And he closed his eyes and ran away before the weapon hit, so he doesn't know if he hit anybody. And he actually was picked up by some American soldiers, and they had pity on him, gave him some food, and took him back to one of their bases where he was held as a prisoner. And he always had very positive memories of the Americans after that, and eventually he came and he lived in the United States. But again, the reason I tell you that is to show how desperate the Nazis were at this point in the war. They were willing to take 12-year-old boys, they were willing to take 60 to 65-year-old men and put them in uniform and make them fight. And this is not a good situation to be in. Now, Germany in the last few months of the war developed some impressive technology, and I think it would be remiss of me not to talk about at least some of them. Germany hoped that they would find a technology that might win the war for them. Of course, unbeknownst to them, the United States had already developed the atomic bomb and would soon drop the atomic bomb on the Japanese in August and July of just August. I misspoke, of 1945. The Germans had several different technologies that they tested out throughout the war, hoping that it would deter the Allies from continued attacks. Probably the most famous of these weapons are the German V1 and V2 rocket programs. The V1 was called the flying bomb. It was effectively a bomb casing with wings, and it could be programmed via radio transmitter to fly a certain distance and then fall, and theoretically this could be used to bomb cities without losing pilots. And so these V1 flying bombs were sent primarily against London, and they would fly and then they would fall out of the sky and they would hit buildings. And even if they were shot down, they would still explode upon impacting the ground. So there was very little the British could do about this other than intercept these things before they got to Britain. But as German air attacks lessened, as American air power started to blast Germany into oblivion, this became more and more difficult. Again, these V-1s were easy to make, but British airplanes were able to meet them over the channel and send them into the water where they couldn't do any damage. The Germans then developed a much larger weapon called the V-2. The V-2 is a huge rocket that was capable of launching itself into the lower atmosphere and then falling all the way to Earth with unbelievable speed and unbelievable destructive potential. A single V-2 rocket could wipe out an entire British bloc, and these V-2 rockets could be fired from incredible range, up to and including 1,000 miles. And so these V-2 rockets began to be used in 1944 to bomb London, and these did significant damage. They were really weapons of terror. It wasn't effectively a weapon to knock Britain out of the war. This couldn't end Britain's ability to arm troops, to create weapons and do things like that, but this could scare the British population because at any moment a huge missile could fall out of the sky and destroy you, destroy your home, kill your loved ones, and the Germans were hoping to terrify the British out of the war, and this failed. By the way, unfortunately, the British and the Americans didn't really learn the lesson, and they used the same techniques on the Germans. The Americans began what's called a strategic bombing campaign, which actually in some ways is an oxymoron because rather than bomb strategic targets for the war, like ammunition plants and tank factories. Instead, the United States simply began to blanket German cities. They began to bomb German cities into the ground, specifically Berlin and a few others were bombed with so many pounds of bombs that they barely resembled a city at the end of it. In fact, the Allies dropped 10 times more bombs on the Germans than the Germans ever dropped on the Allies. Again, this is just testament to the production capabilities of the United States. The United States could produce almost unlimited firepower and weaponry if it needed to. In fact, there's a famous story of a 3,000 plane attack by B-17s on Germany, and the intention of this attack was actually to fly over Berlin, bomb Berlin, and to land on Russian airfields and then be used by the Russians to attack German forces in the east. And almost 1,000 of these planes were shot down, and at the end of the operation, the Allied generals said, we only lost the acceptable amount of planes. And in less than a month, all of those planes had been replaced. Germany simply could not compete. The German Air Force produced 11,000 planes over the course of the entire war. The American Air Force produced 11,000 planes every 2 months. By the end of the war, the Americans had produced more than 600,000 fighting planes. Again, that is a factor that Germany simply could not keep up with. In fact, that's a factor of 60. Imagine trying to fight someone who can produce 60 times more than you can. And by the way, this statistic holds true in almost every area. And remember, this doesn't even come into accounting for British and Soviet production of different products as well. The Allies simply could outproduce Germany in so many ways that by the end of the war, it wasn't even a contest. The Germans were simply being driven into the ground by the incredible resources of the Allies. Other technologies that the Germans used were jet fighter planes. Jet fighter planes were a new development, one that the Soviet Union, British, and the United States would not develop till after the war. A jet brings in air and compresses it down and then uses that to produce high volume thrust out the back. And this enables much faster speeds than even the lightest and fastest of prop planes. In fact, there were German warplanes capable of going almost 600 miles an hour. This is more than 100 miles an hour faster than the fastest American prop planes. Jets are also capable of climbing very quickly, much faster than a prop plane, as going up like this. And because of this, these German jets could fly up incredibly high, and they could do a dive attack on American planes and shoot them down. And in fact, by the end of the war, American planes were being shot down 4-1 to these German jets, which, if the Germans could have kept producing the things, was actually a ratio at which the Americans might have something to be concerned about. But these German jets, only about 100 of them could be produced in the entire war. The other plane technology that the Germans attempted to use what was called the rocket plane, and I'm very fond of the rocket plane. So many people are confused. What's the difference between a jet airplane and a rocket airplane? Well, a jet airplane is an engine that takes in air, compresses it, combines it with fuel, and blows it back out the other end of the engine is thrust. A rocket is a big pile of propellant that you light on fire and it blasts out the other end. Right? You're all familiar with the rockets that take people into space. That's a rocket. There's no air going into that thing. It carries all of the fuel it needs, and when it runs out of fuel, it stops working. And there you have what a rocket airplane works like. It has 12 minutes of flight time. Now, the second you light the thing off, it takes off very quickly, and the rocket was capable of generating thrust that would propel the plane at more than almost at the speed of sound, 650 miles an hour, which was staggering at the time. Probably one of the fastest planes ever to exist at that time in any circumstance, even falling. Okay, this was faster than most planes could go. Unfortunately, this plane, again, had too many issues. It was fast. It was very dangerous for the 12 minutes it was in the air. And that might not seem like a lot of time. You might be, Mr. Morner, I've watched this lecture for more than 12 minutes. That is not a long time. But aerial dogfights don't last very long. One guy dies, the other guy lives. That's usually how it goes. It can happen in less than 30 seconds. So 12 minutes isn't as short as you might think. The problem is that 1 out of 20 times, the plane exploded rather than took off. And so just imagine if a 5% of the time you turned your car on, it blew up. How many of you would use your car? Probably none of you. 5% is way too often for my taste anyway. And by the way, there's a reason that nobody has rocket planes today. No one wants to blow up. The Germans also developed a number of other technologies that I'm just going to list very quickly. They developed nerve toxins, which they intended to use on the Soviets. These are toxins that can kill people in literally seconds. They developed magnetic rail guns, which used electricity to fire bullets at much faster speeds than conventional propellants could fire them. They even were working on a nuclear program that was sabotaged by the British on multiple occasions, although the Germans never would have been able to complete the bomb in time. Certainly not in time to deal with the Americans or the Soviets. Finally, let's get to the fall of Berlin. As earlier mentioned, the Red Army, the Russian army, was advancing, and now it was advancing quickly, especially in March and April of 1945. In February of 1945, the Americans and British began moving, and now the Germans were caught in an unbreakable vice that was crushing them closer and closer together. As earlier mentioned, the German high command began throwing troops at the Russians in a desperate hope that the Americans would move faster and capture Berlin, but the force of the Russian Colossus was simply too great. The city of Berlin was captured by the Germans at the beginning of April 1945, and what would occur there was 30 days of horrendous street fighting for the city. The Allies did use this time well, and the Americans and the Brits captured many of the industrial regions of Germany. So many of the most important regions of Germany were captured by the Allies during this period, while the Russians fought with the Germans over Berlin. Hitler himself retreated to a bunker in the center of Berlin, and he attempted to give orders to his troops from that location. And up into the end, Hitler seemed confident that somehow a miracle would occur and the Germans would survive. And of course, there was no chance of this at that time. Finally, on April 30th, Hitler realized it was all over and took the coward's way out and shot himself rather than answer for his crimes. Several of his leading followers did this as well, the most famous of which was Joseph Goebbels, who not only killed himself, but he actually shot his wife and his 7 children first, and then shot himself in the Nazi command bunker. Hitler's body was never found. Supposedly, it was taken out by German troops in the bunker and it was burned. The Russians claim that they recovered the body and melted it down in acid, and some people suggest that the body was cremated and taken to another location, but the body of Hitler was never recovered. And some people have led to conspiracies thinking Hitler's still alive. I can tell you very confidently that Hitler is dead, and he never had to answer for his crimes to a human, but certainly God held him responsible for what he did at the end of all things. That being said, the war was over. Hitler was dead, and Berlin was in the hands of the Russians. It took a further 7 days from April 30th, May 7th, for the new leader of Germany, Führer Karl Donitz, who used to be the head admiral of the German nation, to sign a formal unconditional surrender. So technically the war lasted 7 days after Hitler's death, but that's because the German government was in such disarray that it took that long for them to finally surrender. Most German troops had already personally surrendered to the Americans and British. And again, we have almost comical accounts of German soldiers saying they had their weapons and they fired all of their rounds towards the Russians, threw down their guns, and literally ran as fast as they could west, hoping to run into the Americans. So we literally have Germans firing their last rounds and then throwing the guns down and running away, hoping to get picked up by Americans. And there's many reports of Americans picking up entire divisions of German troops that didn't have guns anymore. I mean, they'd run out of ammunition, they didn't have anything left, and they were moving west to get picked up by the Allies, the Brits and the U.S. because of the treatment that they were afraid they were going to get from the Russians. With that, May 7th, the war in Europe was over. The last German forces surrendered, and the Allies had won. But of course, this leaves Japan in the East. Now, the United States was winning that war, but it had a serious problem. And that serious problem is going to be the subject of our next lecture, and that was what to do about the Japanese people. The Japanese had proved time and time again that they would not surrender easily, and in fact, many Japanese chose to die to the last man rather than surrender at all. And President Truman, because President Roosevelt had died in April of 1945, President Truman was facing a very difficult problem. Do I lose millions of American soldiers to kill hundreds of millions of Japanese, or do I use a new type of weapon, a weapon of a type that had never been used in history before? That's the story of the next lecture.